The night was perfect. The decorations, the music, the people, it felt like a dream. I was sitting next to my new husband, feeling on top of the world. This was supposed to be the beginning of our forever. Then she grabbed the mic. The second I heard Diane's voice, my stomach sank. My mother-in-law, the woman who had spent years making it painfully clear that she thought I wasn't good enough for her son, was now standing at the center of the reception, microphone in hand, wearing a smug, self-satisfied smile. She tapped the mic twice, clearing her throat. I have a little surprise for the bride and groom. The crowd quieted. Conversations halted. Drinks froze mid-sip. I turned to Jake, my husband, expecting him to be just as confused as I was. But he wasn't confused. He looked furious. Diane's grin widened. I decided to do something special for my son because he deserves the best. So I went ahead and canceled their honeymoon. Silence. I let out a nervous laugh. Surely she was joking. Surely she wouldn't actually. Then she looked right at me, her smile growing wider. Why waste all that money on a trip? She purred. When my son has real responsibilities, that money is much better spent on family. On me. I felt my stomach drop. My heart hammered. I reached for my phone under the table, my fingers shaking as I opened my banking app. And that's when I saw it. The honeymoon fund. Completely. Gone. Every single dollar we had saved. Every wedding gift we had received. Vanished. And the worst part? Diane was still standing there, waiting for applause. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. My entire honeymoon fund, thousands of dollars that we had saved together, plus wedding gifts from friends and family, was gone. My hands turned ice cold, my stomach twisted, and my vision blurred as I stared at my phone screen in horror. Beside me, Jake's face was unreadable, but the way his grip tightened around his phone made my blood run cold. His hands were shaking. Diane was still basking in the attention, her smug little smirk growing by the second. She actually looked proud of herself, like she had just done something wonderful. Then Jake stood up, and the way he looked at her? I had never seen him like that before. His jaw was clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. His eyes were sharp, cold, furious. "Mom," he said slowly, voice dangerously calm. "What did you do?" Diane scoffed, flipping her hair over her shoulder like she was bored of the conversation already. "Oh, stop being dramatic," she said, rolling her eyes. "I transferred the money where it should have been in the first place." I could feel the weight of the entire room watching us. Guests were whispering. Some were outright gasping. A few of my friends had their hands over their mouths in shock. My maid of honor, Sarah, was staring daggers at Diane. "You stole our honeymoon money," I finally said, my voice shaking. Diane laughed. Actually laughed. "Stole?" she repeated, like the idea was the most ridiculous thing she had ever heard. "Oh honey, don't be so dramatic. You're married now. That money should be used for something more responsible, like your husband supporting his mother." I raised him. I deserve it. I couldn't breathe. The audacity. The absolute nerve. Jake, however, didn't blink. Instead, he pulled out a chair, sat back down, and leaned forward with his elbows on the table. His voice was still. Calm, too calm, when he said, "Mom, I want you to tell me exactly what you spent our money on." Diane beamed, as if she thought she was winning this argument. "Well," she said, counting on her fingers, "I paid off some of my credit card bills, then I put a deposit on a new car. You know I've been wanting that luxury SUV for a while. And I booked myself a little vacation. A cruise, actually. You'd be so proud of me, honey. I got the penthouse suite." I felt the room tilt. She stole our honeymoon money, and then used it to take herself on a luxury vacation? Jake exhaled through his nose, his fingers tapping against the table. Then he did something that shocked me. He smiled. But it wasn't a happy smile. It was the kind of smile you see in movies right before everything goes to hell. "That's great, Mom," Jake said slowly. "That's really, really great." Diane hesitated. What do you mean?" Jake leaned forward. "I mean it's great that you spent money that wasn't yours. Because you know what that means." The room went silent. Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it around so Diane could see what he was doing. He was calling the bank. Yeah, hi, he said, still looking Diane dead in the eye. I'd like to report fraudulent activity on my account. Diane's smirk vanished. Her eyes widened. Jake, what are you doing? She snapped. Jake ignored her. Yes, I'd like to dispute several unauthorized transfers. He listened for a second, then nodded. Yeah, I know exactly who did it. I can give you their name and account number right now. Diane shot up from her chair so fast it nearly toppled over. Jake, stop it. You can't. Oh, but I can, he said, still smiling. See, Mom, you're not on my account. You don't have access to my money, which means you stole it. And banks? They don't like fraud. Diane's face turned bright red. The whispers in the room grew louder. Some guests were even recording. Jake tilted his head. I wonder how that's going to look when the bank investigates. Oh, and I should probably call the cruise line too, since you booked that trip. With stolen money. Diane gasped. Jake, I'm your mother. You wouldn't? I would, Jake said simply. And the entire room watched as Diane realized, right then and there, that she had completely screwed herself. But Jake wasn't done yet. He turned to me, took my hand, squeezed it gently. Then he looked back at his mother. By the way, Mom, he said. Diane swallowed. What? Jake's grin widened. You remember that prenup you told me not to sign? The one you said was insulting and a waste of time? She blinked. Of course. Well, Jake said, leaning back, I signed it anyway. Diane froze. I actually thought she might faint. Jake shrugged. And guess what? One of the conditions was that all our accounts remain separate. Which means? He gestured toward my phone. You didn't just steal from me. You stole from my wife. The color drained from Diane's face. And just like that, she knew she wasn't just dealing with her son anymore. She was dealing with me. And I was about to make her regret everything. Diane stood there frozen. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. She looked around, probably expecting someone, anyone, to defend her. Nobody did. Her face twisted in panic, her confidence crumbling in real time as she realized there was no way out. Jake, sweetheart, she stammered, her voice suddenly softer, her usual smugness gone. Let's not get carried away here. It was just a misunderstanding. Jake's expression didn't change. He was staring at her like he was seeing her for the first time, like every illusion of who he thought she was had just shattered. A misunderstanding? He repeated, voice dripping with disbelief. Mom, you stole from us. You drained our honeymoon fund and spent it on yourself. And now you want to pretend it was just a little mix-up? Diane let out a forced laugh, waving her hand like she was brushing off the whole situation. Oh, come on. It's not like you really needed that money. A honeymoon is just a luxury. You'll have plenty of time for vacations later. Family comes first, and as your mother, enough. Jake's voice cut through the air like a knife. Diane flinched. The entire room went silent. Even the servers had stopped moving. The weight of the moment was pressing down on everyone. Every single guest was watching, waiting to see what would happen. Next, Jake glanced at me, his fingers still wrapped around my hand. Then he turned his phone back on speaker just as the bank representative returned to the line. Sir, we've flagged the unauthorized transactions. Since the recipient account is under a different name, we can escalate this as fraud. Would you like us to proceed with a full investigation? Diane's entire body stiffened. The blood drained from her face. Then, in a panic, she lunged forward, trying to grab Jake's phone. Jake, hang up. We can talk about this. Jake smoothly leaned back, keeping the phone just out of her reach. Yeah, he said, proceed with the investigation. Diane let out a choked gasp. You wouldn't do that to your own mother. Jake just stared at her, his eyes cold. You already did this to yourself. The bank rep continued. Understood. We'll be reversing the charges and notifying authorities. This will result in a temporary freeze on the recipient's account while we investigate. If this case is confirmed as fraud, legal action may be taken. Diane screeched. Legal action? No. Tell them to stop, Jake. Fix this. Jake leaned forward, voice ice cold. Oh, don't worry, Mom. I'll make sure you don't get arrested. He smirked. But the money? That's gone. You won't be seeing a single cent of it. Diane was panting now, her breaths coming out in short, frantic gasps. Her eyes were wild, darting around the room, desperately looking for someone to help her, to defend her, but there was no one. Then suddenly something changed. Her expression shifted. The panic? Gone. The desperation? Vanished. Instead she smiled. A slow, unsettling, wicked smile. Fine, she said sweetly. If I can't have the money, then neither can you. Before I could react, she ripped her phone out of her purse, furiously typing something. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. What are you doing? Diane grinned, eyes glinting with malice. Oh, just making a little phone call. She hit the call button. And when she spoke, her voice was sickly sweet. Hi, yes, this is Diane. I need to report a stolen credit card. My stomach dropped. I knew exactly what she was trying to do. She was reporting our wedding account as fraud. If she succeeded, she could trigger a freeze on the funds, including the honeymoon money we had just recovered. This woman was actually willing to sabotage us out of spite. You psycho. I lunged forward, but Jake was faster. He snatched the phone from her hands and put it on speaker. Ma'am, the fraud department rep said, you're reporting a stolen card. Can you confirm the account holder's name? Diane paused. Her mouth twitched. She glanced at me, then at Jake. Jake raised an eyebrow. Go ahead, Mom. Tell them whose account you're reporting stolen. Diane swallowed hard. Well, it's my son's account. The bank rep cut her off. Ma'am, unless you are the primary account holder, you cannot report fraud on this card. False reports will result in legal consequences. Diane's face fell. She looked around the room wild-eyed, realizing she had just screwed herself even more. And Jake? He just laughed. A low, slow laugh that made my heart swell. With pride. Oh, Mom, he said, shaking his head. You just can't help yourself, can you? Diane's face flushed deep red. She was shaking. Before she could say anything else, her phone buzzed. She grabbed it, glanced at the screen, and immediately went pale. Jake smirked. That the bank? She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Because at that moment, another guest, a family friend, cleared his throat and stood up. Diane, he said slowly, you do realize I'm a lawyer, right? Diane's eyes widened. He crossed his arms. And what you just did? That was attempted financial fraud. You literally did it in front of 50 people. People started whispering. A few guests nodded in agreement. Diane staggered back. I wasn't. The lawyer raised a hand, cutting her off. Save it. You might want to get ahead of this before it gets worse. Diane turned to Jake, pleading. Honey, you're not really going to let them do this to me, are you? Jake looked at her for a long, hard second. Then he smiled. You did this to yourself. Diane let out a strangled sob. Jake, please? Jake just shrugged. Enjoy your new vacation, Mom, he said. It might not be a cruise, but I hear jail cells have a lovely view. Diane's face crumpled. And in that moment, I knew she finally understood that she had lost. But the best part? Her downfall had only just begun. Diane's face crumpled, her eyes darting wildly around the room. She was trapped and she knew it. Her usual smugness? Gone. Her fake confidence? Shattered. She opened her mouth, probably to try another excuse, another desperate plea, but it was too late. The damage was already done. Jake stood up, rolling his shoulders like he had just finished taking out the trash. He turned to the lawyer, the one who had just called out Diane's fraud attempt. So, just to be clear, Jake said, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear, what my mother did is considered a crime, right? The lawyer nodded, crossing his arms. Absolutely. What she attempted just now, trying to falsely report fraud on your account, is bank fraud. On top of that, stealing your honeymoon fund and using it for personal expenses? That's theft. Diane let out a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a whimper. No, 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 she muttered, shaking her head like she could somehow erase what just happened. This is all a misunderstanding. You're all ganging up on me. No one bought it. Not a single guest spoke up in her defense. Not a single friend, not a single relative. And then the final blow came. Jake's phone buzzed. He pulled it out, checked the screen, and let out a low, satisfied chuckle. Honeymoon fund recovered. He turned the phone to show me. Every single dollar Diane stole had been transferred back into our account. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. It was over. She lost. But Jake? He wasn't finished yet. By the way, Mom, he said casually, the bank also froze your account for suspicious activity. Looks like you won't be going on that cruise after all. Diane went rigid. What? Jake smirked. Yeah. Turns out, when you steal money and use it for personal vacations, banks tend to, I don't know, stop you from spending it. A few guests started clapping. Diane whipped her head around, her face twisting in rage. You people think this is funny? This is my life. I crossed my arms. No, Diane. This is what happens when you steal from people who actually trusted you. Her face flushed deep red. Her breathing came out in short, furious gasps. Then she did what she always did when she lost control. She turned on me. You, she shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me. This is your fault. You turned my son against me. I met her gaze without flinching. You did that all on your own. Diane's hands clenched into fists. Her whole body was trembling with rage. And then, she did the unthinkable. She lunged at me. I saw it coming a second before it happened. She moved fast, her hands reaching out, but before she could even get close, Jake stepped in front of me. No, his voice was firm, steady, absolute. Diane stumbled back, her face twisted in shock. She looked like she had just been slapped. You don't mean that, she whispered. You can't mean that. Jake didn't hesitate. I do. The entire room was silent. Diane blinked rapidly, her chest rising and falling as she desperately searched his face for any sign of hesitation. She found none. And that's when it hit her. She had lost. Not just the money. Not just her reputation. She had lost her son. Her legs buckled, and for a second I thought she might faint. She reached out, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. No, she whispered again, shaking her head. No, this isn't happening. Jake exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He looked tired, like he had been carrying the weight of this moment for years. Mom, he said finally, we're done? Diane froze. Jake continued, his voice calm but unshakable. After tonight, I don't want anything to do with you. No calls. No visits. No texts. If you ever try to contact me or my wife again, I will file a restraining order. Diane gasped. You don't mean that. Jake tilted his head. I do. She let out a strangled sob. Her hands trembled as she reached out, like she was about to beg. Jake, sweetheart, please. I'm your mother. I raised you. You can't just throw me away like this. Jake's face didn't waver. You threw yourself away. Diane let out a shaky breath, blinking furiously like she could somehow reset the moment, like she could undo everything. But she couldn't. She stared at him, waiting for him to take it back. He never did. And finally, after what felt like forever, she turned and stormed out. The moment the door slammed shut behind her, the room erupted. Applause. Cheers. Laughter. People clapped, people hugged us, people whispered, "It's about time," under their breaths. It was like a celebration. Like everyone had just watched the villain finally get defeated. I turned to Jake, my heart swelling with pride. Are you okay? He smiled. I am now. And in that moment, I knew we had won. But Diane? Her downfall was just beginning. Diane was gone, but the storm she created was far from over. I should have felt relieved, should have basked in the fact that she had finally been put in her place. But I knew better. People like her don't just disappear. And I was right. When I woke up the next morning, my phone was blowing up with notifications. The first message I saw was from one of Jake's aunts. I don't know if you've seen this yet, but wow! Attached was a screenshot of a Facebook post from Diane. She had written a long, dramatic essay, painting herself as the ultimate victim. According to her, she had been humiliated and betrayed by her own son. who of course had been brainwashed by his evil wife. She claimed we had stolen from her, had cut her off for no reason, and had publicly disrespected her in front of the entire family. And the best part? She tagged everyone. I scrolled through the comments section, expecting at least a few people to sympathize with her. But what I found? Oh, it was better than I could have imagined. Diane, weren't you the one who stole from them? You literally admitted to draining their honeymoon fund, and now you're playing the victim. Ma'am, we were there. You made a fool of yourself. You're mad you got caught. That's all this is. One by one, people called her out. Even her own family. Some of her former friends unfriended her on the spot. A few people even shared the video recordings from the wedding, exposing everything. Diane had thought she was controlling the narrative. Instead, she had just destroyed what little reputation she had left. Jake walked into the room, still groggy from sleep. I handed him my phone. You need to see this. He rubbed his eyes, scrolled through the comments, then let out a low whistle. Wow. She really just nuked her own life. I grinned. Yeah. And it's only getting worse. 2 days later, we got a call from Jake's dad. You're gonna want to hear this, he said. Diane is in full meltdown mode. Turns out, the bank fraud investigation had escalated fast. The financial institution had already frozen Diane's account, flagged her as a high-risk customer, and started digging deeper into her records. And what did they find? Multiple unauthorized transactions. Not just from Jake's honeymoon fund. She had a history of borrowing money from family members, maxing out credit cards under different names, and moving funds between shady accounts. This wasn't just one bad decision. This was a pattern. And now, the bank was closing in. Jake's dad chuckled over the phone. She's scrambling. I heard she's trying to get a lawyer, but no one wants to take her case. I raised an eyebrow. Why not? Because she's broke. I blinked. Wait, what? Jake's dad sighed. She was already drowning in debt. The money she stole from you guys? That wasn't just greed. That was desperation. It all clicked. The luxury SUV? The cruise? The credit card payments? She wasn't just spoiling herself. She was trying to cover up her financial ruin. Jake shook his head, letting out a short laugh. So she destroyed her relationship with us. And for what? To end up with nothing? Yeah, his dad said. And now she's facing legal action. I leaned back, exhaling in satisfaction. Couldn't have happened to a better person. A few weeks later, I got an email from an unknown sender. The subject? You might enjoy this. Attached was a photo of Diane at a low-end retail store, working behind the register, wearing a cheap polyester uniform. She looked miserable. The text below read, after the bank froze her assets, she lost access to all her money. Couldn't afford rent. Couldn't afford her car payments. She had to get a job. I laughed out loud. Diane, the woman who had spent years looking down on everyone, was now stuck working a minimum wage job just to survive. And honestly, it was poetic justice. She had spent her entire life thinking she was above everyone else. Now, she was forced to rely on the very system she used to mock. Jake leaned over my shoulder, smirking at the photo. Karma really did her dirty. I grinned. She did it to herself. Months passed. Diane was radio silent. No calls. No texts. No random appearances. And then one day I got a letter in the mail. From her. I almost threw it away. But curiosity got the best of me. Inside was a handwritten note. I know you hate me, but please, I have nothing left. No money. No home. No one to turn to. I made mistakes. I see that now. Please, if you have any heart, help me. I let out a slow breath. Then, I laughed. This woman, the same woman who stole from us, who tried to sabotage our marriage, who framed me for fraud, was now begging for my help. I didn't respond, but I did keep the letter. Because reading it felt like victory. Diane lost everything. Her son, her reputation, her money, and me? I walked away happier than ever. We finally went on our honeymoon, a fully upgraded first-class trip to Greece. And the best part? The wedding guests who despised Diane so much? They sent us extra money just to spite her. We posted photos. Lots of them. And Diane? She saw every single one. According to one of Jake's distant cousins, she cried about it for weeks. The best revenge isn't getting even. It's watching your enemy destroy themselves. And Diane? She did it perfectly. The end.